How much oil does the world use? Or a more appropriate question might be, how dependent is the world on oil? It has become apparent that it is quite a lot, given how the Ukraine conflict has affected energy prices. Hi, I'm Kaveh Tafway. Welcome to another edition of Economic Divide. In this program, we will examine the West's dependence on oil and how U.S.-sanctioned countries like Iran and Venezuela can make up some of the shortage. Coming up in today's program, the world guzzles up oil like you won't believe. The U.S. almost 20 million per day, the EU almost 17 million, and the world a whopping 97.10 million barrels per day. So is it a good idea to sanction countries that are major oil producers? Then the French President Emmanuel Macron has said to the U.S. the world needs oil from Iran and Venezuela to overcome a surge in fuel prices. But the U.S. is not listening, and therefore is shooting itself in the foot. Then the U.S. and now EU, so stubborn that they are shooting themselves in the foot by preventing oil-producing countries to sell their oil on the world market, even if it means that this would hurt their own economies. But for how long can they continue this path? The war in Ukraine has triggered an unprecedented global energy crunch. Over the past few weeks, oil prices have risen to unprecedented levels and are likely to stay above there for months to come, even though the prices have come down below $100. Just recently, Germany's energy minister said the country needs to prepare for a possible escalation of problems on the gas market.
Dass es eine weitere Reduktion gibt, muss man ehrlicherweise sagen, nein, das kann man natürlich nicht ausschließen. Wir haben das bei der Reduktion von Nord Stream 1 gesehen, dass technische Gründe vorgeschoben wurden, und da sie einmal vorgeschoben wurden, kann das natürlich wieder passieren. Das ist jetzt inzwischen ein offenes Geheimnis, und in einer Situation wie dieser kann man natürlich nichts ausschließen.
The situation is not better in the other Western nations either. The European gas market is currently experiencing a severe shortage of imported energy supplies. Deliveries by Russia's Gazprom through the Nord Stream pipeline have fallen to about 40% of capacity.
Europe seems or appears weak on the gas front, so Russia might explore this weakness and send less gas to individual countries.
No doubt, the consumer-driven Western capitalistic society cannot and will not wean itself off of oil. It's addicted to oil, let's face it. But to prevent their own economies from advancing, well, that's what our focus is here in our social media section, especially when it comes to oil from countries like Russia, Iran, and Venezuela. Well, our first stop, a warning from the Russian President Vladimir Putin. He sees catastrophic energy consequences for Europe as sanctions against his country continues.
Дальнейшее использование санкционной политики может привести к еще более тяжелым, без преувеличения, даже катастрофическим последствиям на мировом энергетическом рынке.
The next post shows the OPEC Secretary General Mohammad Barkindo, who said in a speech a few days ago that the global oil supply shortage can be eased if American sanctions on Iran and Venezuela are removed, and that the two countries can export more oil. Now, sadly, he passed away just days after making that statement. Now, this entry caught our attention, particularly since it was a press gaggle by Jake Sullivan en route to Madrid aboard Air Force One that happened on June 28th. The question was addressed to him, the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan.
Jake, there was a video that came out yesterday from the G7 where President Macron is talking to both President Biden and yourself about Saudi Arabia, the fact that they're almost at max capacity and can't produce that much more oil. Does that change the president's thinking at all going into his trip next month? And did any other leaders approach him about his trip to Saudi Arabia?
I'm not going to characterize President Macron's comments yesterday.
Now, this was in reference to this tweet in which a desperate Emmanuel Macron confronts Biden at the G7 summit, insisting that pleas to Saudi Arabia, which can barely increase oil production, won't be enough. They've sanctioned the Russian oil. Now their only hope is for heavily sanctioned Iran and Venezuela to export to Europe. This is what transpired.
You predicted it for a while.
Excuse me, sorry to interrupt you.
I was your advisor. I kept the commission to call MDZ. So I call for increasing the production of Iran minerals. So two things. One, I'm at the maximum, what he claimed, and this is my complete commitment. Second, he told me, according to us, that the Saudis can increase a little bit, but 150 or a little bit more, and they don't have huge capacities at this stage, before 6 months' time. The last one, the very last point is about what we do on the Russian oil. He told me that we should.
Thank you. We got to keep up.
Excuse us.
All right, so there you have it. That was the conversation that Macron had. Let me introduce our guest for this edition of our program. We have Ricardo Vaz joining us. He's a writer and editor at Venezuela Analysis, who joins us from Caracas. Ricardo Vaz, welcome to the program. When you take a look at how France is asking the U.S. president and in turn making a statement about the return of Iran and Venezuelan oil to the global oil market in order to ease the price rise that has occurred, that is something that the U.S. again seems to basically fall on deaf ears. Why do you think the U.S. is presenting this as an obstacle, refusing to cut back on the sanctions when it comes to Venezuela and Iran? I mean, isn't then the U.S. the cause of high energy prices and then not Russia, because it has also sanctioned Russia?
Yeah, I think it's both ironic and hypocritical that after all these measures, unilateral measures from the United States to strangle essentially oil producers like Iran and Venezuela, now all of a sudden it finds itself in a position where it needs desperately for these countries to increase the supply to the global oil markets in order to reduce prices, which are affecting consumers both in the US and Europe and everywhere else. But yeah, as you mentioned, the biggest obstacle to increasing production, especially in Venezuela, which is the case that I know very well, is US sanctions.
Okay, let's bring in Ranjeet Brar, who's a political analyst, joining us from London. Ranjeet Brar, welcome to Economic Divide. The world is dependent on oil from West Asia, or Middle East as it's called. That is not anything new. But the U.S. relationship with some of these countries at this point has frayed. The way that the U.S. president, for example, has carried on with Saudi Arabia, which in turn is obviously a country that influences OPEC a great deal. They have not listened to the U.S. request for an increase in oil production. Do you think then that because of this, the U.S. is shooting itself in the foot by, for example, sanctioning Russia, carrying itself off the way it does with OPEC countries? I mean, why does the U.S. and the EU partners just continue down this path, do you think?
In a sense, they have no option. U.S. dollar is obviously the reserve currency of the world. The euro and the pound are the other reserve currencies of the world, to a large extent, perhaps the yen to an extent. These international tradable currencies have come off the back of an enormous agglomeration of wealth, of capital in those countries, which is to do with the entire colonial policy of those countries. Britain had an empire upon which the sun famously never set, and was directly superseded after World War II by the United States. Their entire economic hegemony has been predicated upon the military superiority, arrogating themselves the role of the global policeman, and they can't get out of that role.
It's time for our Info News section of the program. This is where we take a look at economic news from around the world. Hopefully we have something in your part of the world. Well, first stop, sanctions, in particular sanctions on Russia. Now, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned sanctions risk energy price spike catastrophe. He goes on to say that Western calls to reduce reliance on Russian energy have made global markets spike in oil and gas. Russia is the largest supplier of gas to Europe, providing 40% of EU's gas. No surprise that the Russian president would issue such a warning. Not that the EU nor the US is not aware of it. All right, next up, we're going to take a look at poverty. Yes, poverty based on inflation has plunged 71 million into poverty since the war in Ukraine started. So that shows the effect of the war in Ukraine. The UN Development Program report has found a surge in commodity prices, hitting parts of the world's regions very hard. In terms of, well, if you're curious in terms of which countries it has affected, we're looking at countries like Armenia, Uzbekistan, Burkina Faso, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, Sudan, and also Haiti, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, just to name the few. I have a feeling that list is going to get extended. Next up, let's take a look at U.S. oil sales. We took a look at that. First, the strategic oil reserves has gone abroad. That is the reason why we have focused on it, and I'll tell you why in a second. First of all, millions of barrels have been released, well, to lower domestic fuel prices, which were exported for the month of June. Now, what's interesting here is 5 million barrels were shipped to Italy, France, the Netherlands, India, and China. Can you guess why it's interesting? Because China is one of the destinations. I mean, U.S. selling oil to China doesn't make much sense, does it? That's probably good for another entire show to dedicate to that. Final stop, stagflation. That's right, stagflationary global debt crisis is looming, and things appear to be getting much worse based on that. Big economies such as the U.S. will face a recession and financial turmoil. Now, the next recession is going to be marked by a severe stagflationary debt crisis. So debt is intertwined with one of the reasons behind stagflation as to why it's going to lead to that. Well, those were some of the topics we picked for this section of our program. Of course, as usual, if you have a suggestion or a topic, especially in your part of the world, we would really appreciate it. Contact information is on your screens now. It's time now for our in-depth section of the program. We want to focus in this section on the world's dependence on oil, especially their dependence on oil from West Asia and the top countries that actually guzzle that oil. What better way to do that than to look at the map? Here we have countries with the most oil, billion of barrels. Number one, Venezuela, 303 billion barrels, or a little over. Saudi Arabia coming in at number two, 258,000, a little over that. Iran at number three. Iraq at number four. Kuwait, and then UAE. We're looking obviously at West Asia and how much of the oil is controlled in terms of the production. And then Russia and the US is noteworthy to point out here also in terms of their oil reserves. Now, the reason why we're looking at that is obviously to show how much focus, as I just mentioned, comes or is focused on the oil that's produced and has in reserves, in this case, on countries in West Asia. Next up is how we need to look at the top oil producing countries in order to get a synopsis of just what you saw there. Now, again, Venezuela, 304 billion barrels. Number two, Saudi Arabia, which has 298 billion barrels. Canada, in this case, we've mentioned Canada because sources do not have Canada actually in the top four. But we figured that it's appropriate to put that because more sources outweigh the fact that Canada is in the top four producing oil countries. And then number four is allocated to Iran, which has 156 billion barrels. And these are the countries with the most oil, okay? So now we have to take a look at the share of the global oil reserves broken down in percentage. This is important. Here you have basically a division made between OPEC countries at the top and the non-OPEC countries at the bottom. So the OPEC countries, you can see, again, it's a reflection of what we just covered, but you have Venezuela, 17.8% of the oil reserves of the total world supply. Saudi Arabia, 17.2%. And then you have, for example, Iran at 9%, and then Iraq at 8.4%. And then at the bottom half, you have non-OPEC countries such as Russia, Canada, China, the US, Kazakhstan. And combined, we're looking at 93.5% of the known oil reserves that are in these top 14 countries. So that's important for us in the bigger picture that we are outlining for you over here. Next up is how we are going to take a look at the way that the consumption is now on the oil from these countries. We looked at three geographic areas. First, the US comes in at 19.78 million barrels. Now this is per day. Next, the EU, just shy of about 17 million barrels of oil per day. And then finally, you have the world consumption itself as a whole, which is almost at 100 million barrels per day. 97.1 million barrels of oil is consumed in the world. Now, when you take a look at the percentage coming from West Asia, in terms of the number of countries, it was about 5 or 6. that are in the top producing countries. So you can see how dependent then the world is, and in particular, a country like the US and an area like the EU when it comes to their dependence. So I don't think that the US or the EU can actually afford to play hardball when it comes to Russia or sanctioning out Iran and Venezuela's oil. All right, let's find out what our guest thinks about this. Ricardo Vaz rejoins us. He's a writer and editor at Venezuela's Analysis, who rejoins us from Caracas. Ricardo Vaz, welcome back. The world is dependent on oil from the West Asia region, or Middle East as it's called in other publications, but the U.S. relationship with these countries in some sense has frayed. At this point, OPEC is not really even listening, led by Saudi Arabia, to U.S. demands to increase its output based on the latest that we have in order to offset these high energy prices. Why does the U.S. and its EU partners, led by the U.S. In this case, continue down this path of self-destruction when it comes to sanctioning countries such as, for example, Iran or Venezuela or also Russia?
I think mostly the US and of course its allies are then forced to fall in line, kind of wants to have it both ways. So in a way, capitalist development in the West has always relied on cheap commodities and in particular fuel and oil. And at the same time, the US wants to use sanctions as a way to pressure, I mean, it's a very mild way of saying it, as a way to trigger regime change.
All right, well, let's find out what Ranjeet Brar thinks. He's a political analyst who rejoins us from London. Ranjeet Brar, welcome back. One U.S. think tank I'd like to get your idea on, who has said that the only way that consumers can check West Asia's influence is by the U.S. and the West actually basically pursuing or putting their collective weight together in order to act in a unified manner, as they have put it. And they want to do that in order to counterbalance OPEC. And they want to shift to alternatives. That's been one of their main goals. In order to, I guess, adopt policies conducive to energy security. But we've heard that notion before, but they've been unable to do that because of their addiction to oil. Is that a correct strategy, or is it just confrontational in terms of the way that they're demanding, in a sense, for OPEC to increase production?
It's both confrontational and it's counterproductive, but it's the only strategy in their playbook. So, the whole invasion of Iraq, the fermentation of the Iran-Iraq war, the invasion of Syria and the division of Syria, all of these are aimed at essentially occupying and controlling Middle Eastern oil reserves, but they've failed. And in particular, with the rise of China as an economic power, with the Belt and Road Initiative, with more and more countries no longer willing to dance to the Americans' tune, that moment of unipolar hegemony that the United States experienced following the collapse of the Soviet Union seems to be very much a thing of the past. And countries, even Saudi Arabia, which is America considers its own vassal state, is refusing to dance to the economic tune of the United States. What we're seeing is the rise of a multipolar world. We're seeing the relative decline of the United States and Europe, and along with that, the ending of the period when the United States could manipulate the global currency market and use the dollar in order to sabotage the economies of other countries. When they tried to do that with Russia, when they sanctioned 300 billion of its foreign reserve assets held under their banking system, they found they bit off more they can chew. They failed to destroy Russia. On the contrary, their sanctions against Russia are backfiring, and more countries now are looking to break free of the economic stranglehold that was formerly exercised upon them.
Both Iran and Venezuela have been under severe U.S. sanctions. Just recently, they signed a 20-year cooperation deal to expand their ties in various fields, including oil and gas.
We will witness how the new world will take shape and how we will stand up to problems and secure progress. Iranian and Venezuelan youth should know that the future world will enjoy equality and justice, and that we will stand up to imperialism.
Experts believe extra supply from Iran will be vital to resolving the global energy crisis, as Venezuela's ability to pump additional oil to the markets has been hampered by U.S. sanctions.
Indispensable a fin de fomentar la inversión y articular su ejecución con la demanda. En este contexto, es imprescindible observar debidamente el respeto a la soberanía y derechos de los países productores, así como los consumidores. Esta dinámica que busca el equilibrio
When it comes to the price of oil, there has been a drop in oil prices in the recent days. Although that might sound that it is good news, it's really not the case. Fears of an abrupt weakening of economic growth have been building over the past week. This was reflected in the past in what is called a U.S. yield curve. It has preceded recessions in the past. The Russophobia sentiment by the U.S. and Western countries has continued unabated, and one display occurred at the G7 summit. This is what the Russian FM said about the U.S.
No, it was not us who abandoned all contacts. It was the United States. That's all I can say. And we are not running after anybody suggesting meetings. If they don't want to talk, it's their choice.
And as stated before, it remains illogical, the US then, the European approach toward Russia, when so much of Russian oil, for example, is purchased by Europe. This chart shows just how dependent not only Europe, but the world is on Russian oil. The Netherlands, Germany, Poland, Italy, and the UK are just some of the European countries who are buyers of Russian oil. And what is worse is that when sanctions backfire, the EU doesn't have a plan for life without cheap Russian energy. So what happens next, as stated here? It refers to how Germany has reported its first trade deficit in 30 years. It states that the prospects for West European industry look grim thanks to the US-led sanctions on Russia. Meanwhile, the US Russophobia at the G20 summit was extended to China. It actually issued a warning against China during more than 5 hours of talks with Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, in which he raised concerns over Beijing's alignment with Moscow.
I shared again with State Councilor that we are concerned about the PRC's alignment with Russia. Now, what you hear from Beijing is that it claims to be neutral. I would start with the proposition that it's pretty hard to be neutral when it comes to this aggression. There's a clear aggressor, there's a clear victim, there's a clear challenge not only to the lives and livelihoods of people in Ukraine, but there's a challenge to the international order.
Which brings us to the final piece, and that is US President Joe Biden's upcoming visit to West Asia, where it is widely speculated he will make up with Saudi Arabia to get more oil out of the pariah nation, as he called it. Of course, he rejects that notion.
I guess I will see the king and the crown prince, but that's not the meeting I'm going to. They'll be part of a much larger meeting. No, I'm not going to ask. I'm going to ask. All the Gulf states are meeting. I've indicated to them that I thought they should be increasing oil production generically, not to the Saudis particularly.
So you see, you sanction countries like Venezuela and Iran so you can go and plead with a human rights violator which assassinates the opposition and Palestinian journalists. Go figure. That does it for this segment of the program. Hope you enjoyed it. Questions, comments, suggestions, please send them. Contact info is on your screens now. See you next week.
The U.S. President Joe Biden wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post recently. In it, he said, the region, the West Asia region, remains full of challenges, like Iran. Just a few sentences later, he said, still, compared to 18 months ago, the region is less pressurized and more integrated. That's about the length of time that the Iranian president started his tenure. If only the U.S. stayed out of the region and stopped sanctioning countries, especially oil-producing ones, then there wouldn't be this energy crunch in some sense. At least it would be less of it. That does for this edition of the program. It was great having you with us as usual. However, we would appreciate it a lot if you did send us your comments or questions. We'll make sure to get back to you. Contact information is behind me. From me, Kavitahwe, and the team, it's goodbye until next time.